Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I am here with the intention of giving you a short book review. Every time I say I'm going to make a short video on the channel, it always comes back to bite me because I'm not very good at shortening the length, but this is a review or maybe a why you should read for a book that is itself quite short, so I'm hoping that I will be able to keep it concise, just the amount of needed information. And the book that I'm going to be talking about is The Crysalids by John Wyndham. For anybody who doesn't know, The Crysalids is a classic work of dystopian fiction that was written by John Wyndham in 1955. If you are like me, what you might think of automatically when you think of John Wyndham is his book, The Triffids, which is about, I believe, an alien plant, a form of alien plant life that comes to Earth during or after a meteor shower. So when I had originally picked up The Crysalids, which just happened to be a free selection on Audible and a book that I picked up completely on a whim, I had taken my only knowledge of John Wyndham, which was Triffids and the word chrysalid, which sounds like chrysalis, and I had assumed that it was some sort of alien book. I thought there was going to be weird like hatching of an alien life form or something. It is not. It still falls within that kind of science fiction range. It is a work of dystopian fiction, but there are no aliens. So let's just get that clear from the beginning because that was a misconception that I had before I went into this book. It was written, like I said, in 1955, which was kind of the era of some of these classic dystopian sci-fi works. We had probably the one that was published the most closely would have been Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, which also came out in the 50s. But slightly before that was Brave New World, 1984, which came out in 1948. And then Brave New World was kind of the precursor to that, which was released in the 30s. I think 1932 is when that one came out by Aldous Huxley. But like I said, it was published in 1955, kind of in that era of dystopian fiction, which if you think about the place that the world was at that time, World War II had just finished up about a decade before. The world was kind of plunged into the midst of the Cold War. There was a lot of post-war depression and soul-searching, philosophizing, a lot of contemplating what the point of all that violence was. I guess the fallout of the rise of eugenics, which was obviously a very prominent feature of World War II, and kind of the aftermath of the terrible realization that the nuclear bomb was now in something that was part of the world and something that global citizens are going to have to learn to contend with and live with. So a lot of global anxiety about the way that the world is, the way that people relate to one another, and the power that certain people had over others. So I guess it's not really a big shock that there was a rise in dystopian fiction in those couple of decades. But unlike Brave New World and 1984 and Fahrenheit 451, The Crysalids is a book that I personally had not heard as much about. So I didn't really have high expectations when I went into this book. So I was very pleasantly surprised when I read it. In fact, if I had known that it was dystopian fiction, I may have not even picked it up because I'm sure many people who, had to study these books in high school, then went through that huge YA surge of dystopian fiction, feel a little burnt out on that particular literary device or that concept. But I'm really happy that I didn't know because I immensely enjoyed The Crysalids. And hopefully through this video, I can let you know what sets it apart from those other classic works and why I think it is still very much worth your time. This may have been a book that some people read in school. It was not part of the Newfoundland curriculum, but one thing that for me at least sets it apart from those other classic works of dystopian fiction is that it's actually a coming of age story. And that worked really well for me because that is a literary trope that I really love. I enjoy the coming of age story, and I thought that it worked really well with the setting, and it added a dimension of care and concern for the main character that maybe would not have been as deep for me if it had not had that coming of age element at the same time. So this is a coming of age dystopian story. And just to give you like a very brief overview, in this book, we follow our main character whose name is David Storm, and he's a young boy who's growing up in an unnamed colony, but which takes place in a land that was formerly known as Labrador. And I didn't know this either. So they live in Labrador and they call the land beneath them, I think they call it like Big Noof, which is supposed to be Newfoundland, which is where I am. So when I heard that, I was like doubly excited. I was like, wow, you never see, I mean, in Newfoundland literature, you see things that are set in Newfoundland, but never in kind of more mainstream or classic literature. So the shipping news notwithstanding, but I was very excited to randomly see Newfoundland pop up there. But they live in a Labrador. And this is set in what you very quickly come to realize is a post-apocalyptic setting. So they live in Labrador and they live in very tight-knit colonies that are not very technologically advanced. And they speak of a group of people known as the Old People who were quite a bit more technologically advanced than they are. And the colony that we follow, so David Storm's colony, and particularly David's family and David's father, are a group of religious fundamentalists who believe that the Old People were wiped out by something called the, oh gosh, what do they call it in the book? The tribulation. So people had strayed from the will of God, and then God's punishment was to rain down this tribulation on them. And in the aftermath of the tribulation, there have begun to be certain aberrations in the world. So there are animals, there are plants, and then there are also people who are born with features that don't line up with what they believe is the face of God. So anything that does not adhere to a very strict definition of what nature should look like is immediately cast out as an aberration. They call these differences blasphemies, and then these blasphemies are eliminated. So entire crops will be raised, animals will be slaughtered, and then people will be dealt with if they show any of these blasphemies. So this is the setup that we're given, and we follow this young boy, David, from the time that he is, and when the book starts off, I think he's probably around like 5 or 6 years old, and I think we follow him up into his early adolescence. That's when the bulk of the book takes place, is in his early adolescence. But we follow him as he lives with a father who is probably one of the most militant of these fundamentalists and who has very little tolerance for anything that shows any difference. And David has to come to terms with what that really means. And it means something very different to him when he's a child versus as he begins to age and he gets to learn a little bit more about the world around him. And we have to see how David adapts when surprising events take place and he finds that his world and his family may be a lot more dangerous than he initially thought. So it's a very interesting setup. There's, you have your basic elements that make up a lot of these dystopian-like stories. But I guess given the specific time when this was published, with all of that kind of fear about a nuclear winter, about the after effects of nuclear weaponry, you see that play out in very obvious ways in the narrative. But I, for one, really enjoy post-apocalyptic fiction. It always reminds me of The Gunslinger and kind of the mutations that take place in that book and the way that Stephen King kind of worked those themes into the Dark Tower series. And so when I see it in other books, it always gives me a boost. So we had the coming of age, we had those kind of post-apocalyptic elements. So I was already hooked. And because this book is so short, and because of the nature of that kind of classic dystopian fiction, so not as much the more contemporary YA dystopian fiction where things are very much focused on hope and rebellion and rising above. In these classic works, you're never sure that things are going to turn out well. And in many of them, not to give any spoilers for any of them, but in many of them, there are not happy resolutions. So there was also a great deal of tension in this book because I knew very little about it and I had no idea how it was going to turn out. What I enjoyed is that John Wyndham added this tension. He threaded this tension through the narrative very organically. I am not a big mystery thriller fan. I don't like feeling like I have to race through a book in order to figure out what's going to happen, what the central mystery is going to be. I don't enjoy that kind of like heart-pounding anxiety, but I do enjoy really well wrought tension, and this book, that is what this book had. You were never sure what was going to happen next, what was going to be uncovered, who was going to be safe, who was going to be in danger, how things were going to play out. and I very much enjoyed it. So I had absolutely no idea where it was going, but I felt very invested along the way. The ending, I will obviously not give any spoilers. I will not say if it was happy, if it was sad. I enjoyed the ending. I appreciated it, but it is an ending that draws some criticism and I think is very divisive amongst people who have read the book. So if you have read it, this is obviously going to be fully spoiler free, but if you have read it, I would love to know what you thought of the ending. And I would love to chat a little bit about what I thought about the ending. So if you have read it, then please let me know and we can have a discussion below in the comment section where people don't have to look at it. But there were a lot of things to really enjoy here. Just to give like a rundown, as I usually do in most of my book reviews, I thought that the writing was really solid. This is obviously a classic work. It was written in 1955, so things were still, I think, written a little more formally. Science fiction of that era can be a little dry. I did not find that with this book. I thought that it was pretty accessible, pretty easy to read. It flowed well. I made my way through it really quickly. As I said, I got it on Audible, so I was listening to it as an audiobook, but I kept wanting to listen to it, and there was nothing that seemed overly stylized or like it would provide a barrier to anyone who would like to read it. In fact, I think that once I discussed it on Discord a little bit, a couple of people had said that they read it as younger kids or in school, and I think that it is that level of prose that like it would be accessible to a younger reader, but still enjoyable for an older reader. So I did like the way that it was constructed. The setting was interesting. Like I said, it took place in Labrador and we had Newfoundland there. Wyndham did a great job of building up this bleak, kind of desolate, post-apocalyptic landscape. He talks a lot about the plants and the animals because they're relevant to the story and relevant to the belief system of the people who live there. And it's very easy to visualize or to picture this kind of barren landscape all around you. So the story takes place in a very specific area of land. Like, it is not a huge swath of land. It is very small range, very small area. But he does a good job of building up the setting, of making you feel like you're really immersed in the book. Character-wise, and this is where, again, in classic sci-fi, things can struggle a little bit, because I think in this era, there was a lot of emphasis on thematic exploration and technical prowess. And sometimes the character development would be a bit surface level. And I think this is where the coming of age element strengthens that a little bit. Our main character, David, it's easy to feel endeared to him. You want to follow along with him. You want to see how things are going to turn out. All of his family members and kind of the secondary characters, they're not the most well fleshed out characters. Like, you don't get a lot of character depth. A lot of them stand in for specific ideals or ideas, but they are vibrant enough that you can get a feeling for David's life and how they have impacted him, how emotionally they affect him, how they impact his choices or influence the things that he's going to do. And the cast of characters is, again, quite small. We get David, his family, and then some of his friends. And we follow them throughout the book. But really the person we get to know the best is David. A lot of this book takes place internally. There's a lot of internal monologues. There's a lot of thinking, a lot of supposing what is going to happen. So if you enjoy that format of storytelling, then I think that you will find a lot to like here. But I enjoyed David. The other characters will probably not stand out to me for very long, but I do remember them in relation to the main character and how they impacted him and influenced him. And I think that worked well for the type of story that this was. Thematically, I already talked a little bit about what the world looked like at this period in time. And I think that this was, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that specific form of catharsis that a lot of authors were employing in that kind of post-World War II, Cold War era. There were, again, like I said, there was a lot of mounting anxiety about the possibility of nuclear warfare. There had been this large scale, kind of massive dehumanization of pockets of people, the rise of eugenics, and the idea of an ideal race or an ideal person was something that was very much on people's mind. And what John Wyndham did here is looked at that through the lens of childhood, that kind of untarnished, unblemished, pure look that kids can have, the way that they can relate and empathize with other people before these alternate beliefs get piled on them. And that was a refreshing way to see the story. We get to see a character who is not overwhelmed by cynicism, like the main character in 1984, or a character who is caught up in the system, like the character in Brave New World, or a character who is kind of desperate and on the run, like in Fahrenheit 451. So we get to see like a little bit of that naivety of childhood. So naivete, it's a weird word to say out loud, but we get to see a little bit of that kind of like pure wonderment that children have. But we also get to feel that rising fear and the stark and harsh realities of life that arrive in early adolescence, when you begin to truly understand what the world looks like around you. But I think that there are some interesting points that are raised. Overall, the Crysalids does not do anything radically different from any of these other classic works of dystopian fiction. It does have the coming of age element, which I think gives it something that I particularly enjoy. It's very tightly written, and like I said, the tension is maintained well throughout the novel. And I think it's just nice to read some of these works of classic sci-fi. It gives you a bit of a lens to look back at the world, to see what kinds of things people were thinking about, what they felt was worth writing about, and it tells you a little bit about what the world was like at that time. I was so surprised to enjoy this so much, and I really wanted to put this video together because if you, like me, had skipped over this one when you were kind of making your way through the sci-fi classics, the dystopian classics, I think that is very much worth your time. It is something that can be enjoyed by many ages. I think like early or late elementary school, like early junior high readers would have a really good time reading this. So if you have kids that are that age, you could definitely read it together and discuss. I think that it makes for a great short palate cleanser. It is a great book to kind of put in between those bigger fantasy works that you have on your TBR. And I would just like to have more people to talk to about it because it came as such a pleasant surprise for me. And I thought that I would pass the word along. Here's a great and tightly woven short novel that you can pop on your TBR. Sorry. So if you have read the Crysalids, I would love to know what you thought. If you haven't read the Crysalids, it would be great for you to put it on your TBR, like I said, to break up some of those bigger books. And I will see you with another video soon. Bye.